Title: The Haunting of Eleanor Finch, Chapter 1, A New Beginning. Eleanor Finch stood in the doorway of her new home, the faint remnants of an old world lingering in the air. The house was older than anything she had ever known, its weathered brickwork faded by time, the ivy creeping up the walls like 1,000 silent hands reaching to drag the house back into the earth. It was an imposing structure, as if it had witnessed centuries of human folly and sorrow. To her, it was both a prison and a sanctuary, an opportunity to begin again. Her brother Noah stood behind her, nervously clutching the worn handle of his suitcase. His eyes, wide with both fear and curiosity, scanned their surroundings. The quietness of the house was unnerving. The town, too, was oddly still. It was as if life itself had taken a step back, waiting for them to make the first move. "Come on, Eleanor, we can't stand here all day," Noah urged, his voice brittle with a mix of apprehension and excitement. "Let's just get this over with." Eleanor hesitated. The air around the house felt thick, almost oppressive, as though the land itself was holding its breath. She could feel it, the way the house seemed to draw her in, to welcome her with a hidden malice that she couldn't quite place. A sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, rustling the dry leaves scattered across the yard, and she shuddered. It was as if the house were speaking to her, warning her of something unspoken. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped inside, the heavy wooden door creaking as it swung open. The smell of old wood, damp stone, and a faint trace of something, musty and decayed, filled her nostrils. She pushed the unsettling feeling down and forced a smile at Noah, but her unease didn't fade. The floor beneath her feet groaned, its ancient bones protesting each step she took. "Wow," Noah murmured as they entered the hallway. The ceilings were high, too high for her liking, casting shadows that seemed to stretch beyond their reach. The wallpaper was peeling in places, exposing the brittle wood beneath. There were no vibrant colors, no personal touches. Everything about the house felt like a ghost of the past, cold and indifferent. "Look at this place. It's huge," Noah said, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "I thought you said it was a fixer-upper, but this place feels like it's falling apart." "It's just old," Eleanor replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "We'll make it work." She tried to convince herself, as much as Noah. This was supposed to be their new start, away from the memories of their parents' tragic death in that car accident. The house, isolated in its own little world, was meant to offer a clean slate. But as she looked down the hallway, with its dim light flickering uncertainly, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this house had its own history, a history it wasn't eager to share. Noah wandered into the parlor, the first room on the left. Eleanor followed him, her footsteps hesitant. The room was grand but neglected. A large fireplace loomed at one end, its hearth cold and untouched for years. The windows were covered with heavy drapes, blocking out the light. She pulled them back, letting the grey afternoon light filter through. The air was musty, stagnant, as though the house had been holding its breath for far too long. "Do you think we could make it cozy in here?" Noah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was trying to inject some optimism, but even he could sense the oppressive weight that hung in the air. "We'll fix it up. Just give it time," Eleanor said, forcing a smile as she set down her bag on a nearby table. She scanned the room, her eyes catching the faint outline of something. An old portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. It depicted a woman with pale, gaunt features and dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the canvas, staring directly at her. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as she glanced away quickly. "Who's this?" Noah asked, following her gaze. Eleanor stepped closer to the painting. The woman in the portrait was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her expression stern, almost regal. Eleanor felt an inexplicable discomfort in her chest as she stared at the woman's cold eyes. She didn't recognize her, but there was something about her presence in the room that felt wrong, like the woman was watching them, judging them. "I don't know," Eleanor muttered, her voice tight. "I'll take it down later." Noah didn't seem to notice her unease. Instead, he wandered off to explore the rest of the house, his footsteps fading into the distance. Eleanor remained where she was, her eyes still fixed on the portrait. The longer she stared at it, the more her surroundings seemed to fade. The house, the world outside, it all seemed distant and out of focus. The air grew heavier, as if the walls were closing in on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a low, distant thud, followed by a scraping noise. Eleanor spun around, her heart pounding. It sounded like it came from the attic. She swallowed, her throat dry. It was probably just the house settling, she thought. These old buildings had a way of making strange noises, didn't they? Still, a chill crept up her spine, and she found herself hesitating. The attic. That was where all the old things were stored. The boxes, the forgotten memories, the place where things were hidden and left behind, waiting to be unearthed. Something about it felt off. Eleanor made her way to the staircase, her hand gripping the banister tightly as she ascended. The house creaked and groaned under her weight, but it wasn't the house settling. The sound, whatever it had been, seemed to follow her, growing louder with each step she took. It was as if the house was alive, breathing with her. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, as though someone, or something, had recently passed through. She could feel the cold air seeping from the crack in the door, and the smell of dust and decay wafted down the stairs. Eleanor hesitated again, the darkness of the attic beckoning her like a forbidden secret. She wasn't sure why, but something compelled her to push the door open, to see what was inside. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was something darker, something the house had been whispering to her since she stepped inside. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing the door open slowly. The creaking of the hinges sounded louder in the silence, and the cold air hit her skin like a slap. Inside, the attic was dimly lit by the weak light that filtered through a single cracked window. Dust hung thick in the air, making the space feel stagnant, forgotten. Old furniture was scattered about, broken chairs, an overturned chest, and boxes piled high with things long abandoned. But what caught Eleanor's attention was the large, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. It was out of place, the only piece of furniture in the room that wasn't covered in dust or cobwebs. The glass was dark, reflecting nothing but shadows, as though the mirror itself had been trapped in time. Eleanor's reflection appeared in the glass, but something was wrong. She didn't move, yet the reflection seemed to shift, almost as if it were separate from her. For a moment, her reflection was not her own. It was someone else, someone with hollow, lifeless eyes, their face gaunt and pale. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stepped back, her breath coming faster. The mirror was alive. It was as if it had absorbed the souls of the past, trapping them within its frame. A loud bang echoed through the attic, followed by a soft whisper, like a voice calling her name. Eleanor! Her name, soft but unmistakable. She spun around, her heart racing, but the attic was empty. No, not empty. The mirror. She could feel its eyes on her, watching her every movement. With a shudder, Eleanor slammed the door shut and rushed down the stairs. Her mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was impossible. The house was just old, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that something was wrong. As she descended into the quiet, empty house, the whispers seemed to follow her, barely audible but ever present. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. The name echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder that the house held secrets it was not ready to reveal. Chapter 1. A New Beginning. Part 2. Eleanor sat in the parlour, the shadows of dusk stretching long across the room, casting eerie shapes against the peeling wallpaper. She was trying to steady her nerves, but every minute spent in the house seemed to tighten the grip of unease around her chest. She forced herself to focus on the room, on the mundane tasks of unpacking, of making this place feel more like home. But each object she moved seemed to carry the weight of some unspoken history, some lingering presence. The house wasn't silent, it was listening, watching, waiting. Noah had retreated upstairs, probably trying to make sense of his own discomfort in this new, strange home. He'd barely said a word since they'd arrived, and Eleanor noticed how often he glanced over his shoulder, as though he could feel the eyes of someone, or something, lurking in the corners of the house, unseen but ever present. She rose and crossed the room to the grand fireplace, touching the mantel with her fingers. The wood was cold, lifeless, and there was something strangely hollow about the space. It wasn't just the silence, or the dust that clung to everything. There was a kind of weight in the air, an oppressive stillness that made the room feel as though it had been abandoned for far longer than the house's actual age. The photograph. She couldn't stop thinking about the portrait she had seen earlier, the woman's cold eyes watching her from across the room. There had been something unsettling about the way the woman's gaze seemed to pierce her very soul, as though she knew Eleanor, had known her for years, long before she even set foot in this house. Eleanor tried to shake off the feeling. "It's just an old house," she whispered to herself. "It's just an old house with old things. It can't hurt you." But her words felt hollow, as if they didn't belong to her. She was trying to convince herself, and yet the weight of the house seemed to seep deeper into her mind with each passing moment. A sudden crash from upstairs sent her heart lurching into her throat. Eleanor froze, her hand gripping the edge of the fireplace mantel. The sound had been sharp, unmistakable, like something heavy had fallen. She swallowed hard and glanced towards the staircase, where the shadows at the top seemed to stretch and writhe in the dimming light. "Noah!" she called, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Noah, are you okay?" There was no response, just the eerie stillness that seemed to fall over the house like a thick fog. She could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears as the seconds dragged on, and the house seemed to hold its breath with her. Cautiously, Eleanor moved towards the stairs. Each step was slow, deliberate, the sound of her feet against the old wooden floorboards muffled by the thick silence. The temperature in the house had dropped noticeably. A cold draft whispered through the hallway, brushing against her skin like fingers made of ice. She reached the bottom of the staircase and stood still for a moment, listening, but all she could hear now was her own heartbeat, a rapid thud in her chest. The house, she realized, was not silent. It was holding something back, waiting. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor began to climb the stairs. The creak of the steps echoed through the hall, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence of the house. She reached the landing and hesitated at the top, scanning the hallway that stretched before her. The light above flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of her vision. "Noah!" she called again, her voice more forceful now. Her nerves were fraying at the edges. She had to find him. She had to make sure everything was all right. The door to the room at the end of the hall was cracked open. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she approached, her steps slow, deliberate, as if she were entering a room of secrets. She pushed the door open with trembling hands and stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from the half-open window, where the last traces of daylight struggled to break through the clouds. But it wasn't the dimness of the room that made her freeze in place. It was the sight of Noah. He was standing near the far wall, his back to her, facing the large, ornate mirror that had been placed there. He didn't seem to hear her enter, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge her presence. He was staring at his reflection with an intensity that unnerved Eleanor to her core. His eyes were wide, unfocused, as if he were looking through the glass rather than at it. "Noah," Eleanor whispered, her voice a mixture of confusion and concern. "What are you doing?" No answer came. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand outstretched toward him, but she felt an icy chill rise from the floor, seeping into her skin. The temperature in the room had dropped sharply, as if something had shifted in the very air around them. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but just as her fingers brushed against his coat, Noah turned his head sharply towards her. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, the pupils so dilated they were barely visible. His lips parted, but instead of words, a sound escaped, low, guttural, something not quite human. "Eleanor." His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. It was as though he were speaking through a haze, something distant and broken. I saw it. I saw her." Eleanor recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest. She took a step back, a cold shiver running down her spine. "Saw who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" But Noah's gaze remained locked on her, his expression hollow, as though he were seeing something, someone behind her. His lips trembled as he muttered again, his voice distant, barely above a whisper. "Sarah. Sarah is still here." The air around Eleanor seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. The name rattled through her mind like a warning bell, echoing from deep within the house. It was the same name that had haunted her thoughts since she first stepped into the attic, the same name that had whispered on the wind. Before Eleanor could respond, Noah took a sharp breath and stumbled backward, crashing into the floor with a heavy thud. His body twitched, his fingers spasming as if he were caught in the grip of something unseen. A high-pitched wail filled the room, a sound so full of terror and anguish it made Eleanor's stomach turn. She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to help him, but her mind was clouded by a growing sense of dread. What had he seen? What was happening to him? The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing down like the hand of a giant. She glanced at the mirror, where Noah's reflection still stared back at her, except it wasn't his face anymore. The woman from the portrait was there, staring at her with those same haunting eyes, and behind her, just out of sight, stood a figure, a tall, shadowy form, barely distinguishable, but unmistakable in its presence. It was the figure of a man, his face obscured by the darkness. Noah was still twitching on the floor, his body jerking violently, but he was no longer in control. His mouth opened again, but the words that came out were not his own. "Get out! Get out before it's too late." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Her heart raced in her chest as she fought to comprehend the terror unfolding before her. In that moment, the house was alive. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Walls. Or the house had its own pulse, Eleanor realized as the days wore on. A rhythm that beat in the hollow chambers, in the shifting of the floorboards, in the damp corners where shadows never fully receded. It had been 3 days since Noah's strange outburst in the room with the mirror, but the silence between them had grown thick, suffocating. Noah refused to speak about what happened, and though he looked at her with haunted eyes, as if he were seeing something beyond her, beyond the house, Eleanor could never bring herself to ask again. The fear in his eyes was enough to convince her that whatever they had glimpsed that night in the mirror was beyond their understanding. She spent her days trying to anchor herself in the house. She tried to decorate, to clean, to organize, as if performing these mundane tasks would somehow make the creeping dread fade. But the more she settled in, the more the house seemed to settle around her, breathing with her, shifting like a living entity. The walls groaned at night. The windows rattled in their frames when no wind blew. It wasn't just the house that was changing, it was her. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone, not truly. There was something, or someone, following her, watching her every move, every breath she took. She had never been a superstitious person, but the house, it had a way of twisting reason, of blurring the line between what was real and what was not. She'd find herself standing in rooms without remembering how she'd entered them, her fingers brushing over things she could not recall touching. The whispers were the worst, soft, elusive, like the rustle of dry leaves. She could never place where they were coming from, only that they were there, always behind her. When she turned to look, there was nothing, only the echo of her own pulse in the silence. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of old letters she had found hidden in the back of a drawer in the parlor. They were yellowed with age, the ink faded in places, but the names scrawled on the front of the envelope stood out starkly against the decay. Sarah O'Bannon. The name from the portrait. The name Noah had whispered in his delirium. Eleanor's fingers hesitated over the stack before she finally picked up the top letter. It was addressed to someone named Victor, a name that meant nothing to her, and the date was from over a century ago. She slowly pulled the letter from the envelope, feeling the crisp paper beneath her fingertips. The words were written in an elegant hand, the script flowing, yet darkly insistent. The ink had bled in some places, as though the writer's emotions had soaked into the paper itself. She began to read aloud, though her voice felt strange in the empty kitchen. "Victor, I must warn you, for I fear the worst is upon us. The house, it is changing. The walls are no longer silent, no longer still. Something stirs beneath them, something dark, something that was never meant to awaken. Sarah is here. I have seen her. She is watching us, waiting for us to notice her, and when we do, it will be too late. She speaks to me in my dreams. Her whispers fill my ears even now. Do not ignore her, for that will be your doom. Please, if you can, leave before it's too late, before she claims you, as she claimed them." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The letter was cut off abruptly, the final words blurred into a smear of ink. Her heart raced, and she turned it over, but there was no signature. The writer's identity remained unknown. Sarah. Again. The name clung to her like a curse, like an omen. "Who are you?" Eleanor whispered under her breath, clutching the letter tighter. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow heavy, thick with the weight of some unseen presence. There was a creak from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She glanced towards the staircase, her gaze locked on the darkened hallway that led to the second floor. "Noah," she called, her voice hoarse, swallowed by the silence that followed. There was no answer. The footsteps continued, slow and rhythmic, as if something was pacing. Eleanor's heart pounded against her chest as she stood, leaving the letter behind, her feet carrying her towards the stairs despite every warning her mind screamed at her. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, and by the time she reached the landing, the chill was unbearable. The hallway stretched before her, suffocating in its darkness. She took a step forward, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Then she heard it again. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. A sound that was faint but unmistakable. Eleanor's skin prickled, her senses heightened. The sound came from Noah's room. Without thinking, she moved toward the door, her hand reaching for the knob, trembling with uncertainty. She could feel her own heartbeat, each beat like a drum in the otherwise suffocating silence. The house felt alive with her movements, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to step into the room. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the low groan of old wood adding to the atmosphere of dread that clung to the air. Noah was sitting in front of the mirror again. His back was to her, his body stiff and unmoving. His reflection was as blank as the first time she had seen it, though his eyes were wide open, unblinking. His mouth hung open, a thin trail of saliva trickling from the corner of his lips. "Noah!" Eleanor shouted, rushing forward, her hands grabbing at his shoulders. "What's happening to you?" He did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the mirror, and Eleanor followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing. Just the dim reflection of the room behind her, the faint outlines of furniture in the half-light. But then the image shifted, as if something was moving within the glass, out of sight from her eyes but not from Noah's. The air thickened with an unnatural pressure, the temperature dropping to a freezing point. Eleanor's breath came out in sharp gasps as the mirror seemed to warp, the glass rippling as though it were made of liquid. And then the woman appeared. She was standing behind Noah in the mirror, her form as solid as the glass itself. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her outline was unmistakable. The same woman from the portrait, Sarah O'Bannon. Eleanor's pulse raced as Sarah's figure stepped closer to Noah's reflection, until their faces were mere inches apart. Sarah's eyes were black as night, her features warped in ways that made Eleanor feel nauseous. A chilling smile twisted on the woman's lips, cold and knowing. Noah's lips parted again, but no sound escaped them. Sarah's reflection turned to Eleanor, her mouth opened wide in a silent scream, the image distorting further as if the glass were trying to contain the horror within. The scream rang in Eleanor's ears, though no sound left the woman's lips. And then, the mirror shattered. Glass rained down around them, sharp and dangerous, but Eleanor couldn't move. She stood frozen, staring at the empty room reflected in the shards. The woman was gone, but something else remained. The air was thick with a terrible, suffocating presence, as though the house itself had reached out to claim them. Noah's body slumped forward, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His body was as cold as ice. And yet, as Eleanor knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against his still hand, she could feel the faintest flicker of life beneath his skin. A heartbeat. Faint and irregular, but it was there. The house wasn't finished with them yet. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Forgotten. Eleanor woke to the smell of damp earth, but the room was silent. It should have been a relief. Yet as her eyelids fluttered open to the dim light that filtered through the curtains, a deep unease washed over her. The mirror in Noah's room had been shattered the night before, its sharp edges now swept into a corner by an invisible hand. She hadn't seen Noah since the terrifying incident with the mirror, the moment when Sarah's reflection had come to life, grinning in the glass as Noah had slumped into unconsciousness. But Noah had come back to her, hadn't he? She sat up abruptly, the covers tangling around her legs. A chill ran down her spine as she looked around the room. It was just as she'd left it, empty and still. Noah's absence weighed heavily on her mind, the question of where he had gone, why he wasn't here, gnawing at her. She had checked on him twice through the night, her hand brushing his cold skin to make sure he was alive, but now he was nowhere to be found. The house felt different this morning. The silence was oppressive, as though the walls were pressing inward, as though they were trying to keep something in, or out. Eleanor got out of bed, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She stepped carefully toward the door, hesitating for a moment before she opened it, the cold air from the hallway creeping in. Maybe he's in the kitchen, she murmured to herself, though she didn't really believe it. Noah hadn't left the room last night. Not that she could remember, but she had to check. She had to know where he was. The kitchen was empty. The house seemed to echo with the faintest sound of footsteps, as if someone, or something, was moving just out of her sight. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. The house was playing tricks on her. She had to stay focused, had to keep herself grounded. Focus, she whispered. Noah must be somewhere. She moved through the rooms, calling his name, her voice weak and distant as though the house swallowed her words. It was strange. The halls were darker than usual, the shadows longer, stretching unnaturally across the floor. She passed the parlor where she had found the letter yesterday, but something was different. The air felt heavier in the room, and she froze. There, in the corner, the portrait of Sarah O'Bannon still hung, but it looked changed. The woman in the painting, her once serene face was now twisted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes, black as midnight, seemed to follow Eleanor as she moved. It was as if the painting were breathing, alive in a way that defied logic. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She took a hesitant step closer, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing the frame. The instant her hand made contact, a cold shiver ran up her spine, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of an invisible force. Suddenly the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness. Her pulse spiked as she stumbled back, her heart racing. Her eyes frantically searched the room, but there was nothing, just the lingering shadows. But then, the whispering began again, soft at first, like a rustling in the walls, but as Eleanor stood frozen, it grew louder, clearer, a voice. It was low and guttural, like something dragging itself from the depths of the earth. Eleanor. Her name. It was a sound like nothing she had ever heard. It made her blood run cold, her body stiff with terror. The whispering grew more insistent, more desperate. Eleanor, come closer. Eleanor forced herself to move, retreating backward into the hallway. But the voice continued, pulling her in, urging her toward the parlor again. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The house was alive with it. As she stepped backward, her foot caught on something. She tumbled, crashing into the wall. Pain flared up her side, but she barely registered it. The voice was still there, louder now, as though it were coming from all around her. And then, silence. Eleanor opened her eyes, realizing that the whispering had stopped. But it wasn't gone. It had simply changed. Now, in the silence, the air itself felt charged, as if something invisible was circling her. watching her. She slowly stood up, her head spinning, and turned to look down the hallway. And that's when she saw him. Noah stood at the end of the hallway, his face pale, his eyes vacant, staring directly at her. But he wasn't the same. His clothes were torn, stained with something dark that looked like blood. His hair hung in matted strands around his face. And his skin was sickly, drawn tight over his bones. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "I found her." His words sent a shock through Eleanor's chest. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You found her," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Noah nodded, but it wasn't the same Noah. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were trapped somewhere else, somewhere far away. His body stood before her, but his mind had gone. She showed me things," Noah continued, his voice hollow and broken. "Things that I shouldn't have seen. She's here, Eleanor. She's always been here." Eleanor reached out to him, but Noah stepped back. His eyes darted to the end of the hallway, where something stirred in the shadows. The temperature dropped, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Noah, listen to me," she pleaded, her hand trembling as she reached for him. "What happened? What did you see?" But Noah didn't answer. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, and his lips quivered as he spoke again. She wants us to join her," he whispered. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Noah's body collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud. Eleanor screamed, rushing to his side. But when she touched him, his skin was as cold as ice, his body stiff and unyielding. Her heart pounded in her chest as she shook him, but there was no response, no warmth, just the hollow echo of a man who had ceased to exist. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Sarah O'Bannon, the woman in the portrait, the whispers, the shattered mirror. And now Noah, lying lifeless before her, his soul seemingly taken. She looked up, her breath freezing in her chest, as the hallway before her seemed to warp, the walls groaning under some unseen weight. The shadows stretched impossibly long, and Eleanor realized with a sinking heart that the house had never been her home. It had never wanted her to stay. She turned, her legs trembling beneath her, but the door was gone. The hallway now stretched endlessly in front of her, the walls narrowing, closing in like the jaws of some ancient beast. And behind her, in the distance, she heard it again, the whispering, "Come, closer." Chapter 3. Echoes of the Forgotten. Continued. Eleanor's chest tightened as she stumbled backward, her hands trembling, eyes darting frantically from the empty hallway to the lifeless form of Noah sprawled on the floor. She felt a surge of nausea rise in her throat, threatening to choke her. The house seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, to ignore the creeping dread that curled around her, tightening like a noose. Noah was gone. The man who had been so vibrant, so full of life just hours before, had been reduced to this, a hollow shell, a body with no soul, no essence. His skin was clammy, his body stiff and unyielding, his eyes staring into nothingness. Eleanor's fingers brushed against his cold wrist, searching for a pulse that wasn't there. Nothing. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, saturated with the stench of decay and old earth, and for a moment it felt as though the walls were closing in on her. She had to get out. She had to leave this place, to escape whatever had taken Noah, whatever had turned this house into a prison. But the door was gone. The hallway stretched out in front of her like a black void, endless, unyielding. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the shadows twisting and shifting, as if something was lurking just beyond her vision. Eleanor could hear the faint whispering again, coming from somewhere deep within the house, growing louder, more insistent. Come closer, Eleanor." Her name, spoken with a voice that was at once familiar and alien, echoed through her mind like a bell tolling in the distance. She clutched her chest, her breath shallow and erratic. The voice was inside her head now, swirling around her like smoke, pulling her toward something, dragging her toward the heart of the darkness that consumed this place. With every step she took, the house seemed to change. The floors groaned beneath her feet, and the walls closed in tighter, squeezing her, pressing against her like an invisible hand. She couldn't escape. The whispering was louder now, more urgent. She could feel the temperature drop. A chill that pierced her bones, that clung to her skin like ice. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to flee, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the house had already claimed her, already decided that she would be part of its darkness, its eternal night. "Stop it," she muttered, her voice trembling as she tried to steady herself. "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" But the house would not relent. The whispering grew louder, and then, for a moment, the silence was absolute. Eleanor stood at the edge of the hallway, her body shaking, her mind teetering on the brink of madness. And then, from the darkness, a figure appeared. At first it was nothing more than a shadow, a shape moving in the periphery of her vision. But as it drew closer, Eleanor's blood ran cold. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of human anatomy. Its face was obscured by a hood, its features hidden in the shadows, but Eleanor could feel its eyes on her, piercing through her, digging into her soul. It was the thing that had been whispering her name. The figure stepped forward, its presence making the air around her crackle with energy. Eleanor tried to step back, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped in the grip of the thing that had come for her. "Who are you?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that made Eleanor feel as though she were being dissected, stripped bare. The air around her thickened, became oppressive, as though the weight of the thing was pressing down on her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. And then, a voice, a cold, hollow voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, spoke. "She called for you, Eleanor. She called you by name. You have answered. Now. You belong to her." Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head. "No, I didn't answer. I didn't mean to." But the figure did not respond. Instead, it reached out with one long skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long and spindly, reaching for her throat. Eleanor's body moved on its own, as if her limbs had been taken over by some unseen force. She tried to scream, to fight, but her mouth was dry, her throat constricting, suffocating under the pressure of the figure's touch. "We've been waiting, Eleanor," the voice continued, its tone devoid of emotion. "Waiting for you to see the truth. Waiting for you to understand." The figure's grip tightened, and Eleanor's vision blurred, her consciousness beginning to fade. The shadows around her deepened, swirling, folding in on themselves, becoming one with the blackness that threatened to consume her. She could feel herself slipping, sinking into the abyss, her body growing weaker, colder. "You are already one of us," the voice whispered. And then, with a final gasp, Eleanor collapsed into the darkness. When Eleanor opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the hallway. She was somewhere else, somewhere darker, colder. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something ancient and long forgotten. She tried to move, but her limbs were heavy, as though they no longer belonged to her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against cold stone, rough and unforgiving. She was in a room. No, not a room. It was a tomb. The walls were covered in strange, intricate symbols, carved deep into the stone. The ceiling arched high above her, lost in shadow. The floor beneath her was made of stone, slick with moisture. She could hear the faintest dripping sound, the echo of water falling somewhere in the distance. And then she saw it. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, a black stone altar, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. Resting upon the altar was a book. Its cover was made of dark, cracked leather, and its pages were yellowed with age, the words on them written in a language that Eleanor could not comprehend. but she could feel the power of the book, could feel it calling to her, beckoning her to come closer, to open it, to read its secrets. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached out toward the book, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the altar. And as her fingers made contact, the world seemed to shift, the room warping around her. She was no longer alone. Figures, shadowed and indistinct, stood at the edges of the room, watching her, waiting. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, pinpricks of light in the black void. They were not human, not in the way that she understood it. They were something else, something old, something forgotten. One of them stepped forward, its face hidden in shadow, its form impossibly tall. The others followed, their movements slow, deliberate, like a procession. "She has come," the figure intoned, its voice deep, resonant, filling the room. "She has come to fulfill the prophecy." Eleanor recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. I didn't want this." But it was too late. The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows pressing down, suffocating her. The whispers returned, louder than before, echoing in her mind, drowning out everything else. "Come closer, Eleanor. Come closer to the truth." The shadows swallowed her whole. Chapter 4. The Bound Ritual. Eleanor's body trembled as the last echo of the whispers faded from her ears, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed in from all sides. The room was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, as though the very air around her had been frozen in time. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her lungs fighting against the weight of the dark atmosphere that seemed to have thickened with every passing second. The shadows shifted. They were not just dark patches in the corners of the room anymore, but living, breathing things, pulsing and writhing like serpents under a heavy, suffocating veil. Eleanor's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the sight before her. The figures, shrouded, twisted, with elongated limbs and haunting faces, stood still, watching her, their eyes burning with an intensity that made her feel as though they were peering into the deepest recesses of her soul. And then, one of them moved. It stepped forward slowly, its movements deliberate and unnervingly smooth, as though it were gliding above the floor rather than walking on it. Eleanor's eyes followed it, her body paralyzed by a growing terror that she couldn't shake. There was something about this figure, something ancient, something so far beyond her understanding, that it filled her with dread, an existential horror that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The figure's face, if it could even be called that, was a blur of darkness, a mask of nothingness, with only two faint points of light where its eyes should have been. A voice, deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder from a distant storm, emanated from its form. "You are not meant to be here, Eleanor." Her name fell from its lips like an incantation, a word of power, but she could not comprehend the weight it carried. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing down on her chest as though the very weight of the house had come alive. "But now that you are here," the voice continued, its tone colder than ice, "there is no turning back. You have opened the door, and now you will be part of it all." Eleanor's mind raced. The door? What door? What was it talking about? She tried to move, to run, but her legs refused to obey. She could feel something crawling beneath her skin, a sensation so alien, so invasive, that it made her want to tear at her flesh to make it stop. The figure stepped closer. "You are connected to us now, Eleanor," it said, its voice shifting, taking on an eerie cadence that reverberated in her mind. "You are bound to the house, bound to the ritual, bound to Sarah." The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. Sarah. The girl whose name she had heard in the whispers, the one whose memory seemed to cling to the very walls of the house. The figure's words were like a spell, a binding, and they made her skin crawl with their significance. "Sarah has been waiting for you," the figure said. "She has been waiting for someone to open the door, for someone to join the ritual." Eleanor shook her head, her mind spiraling into chaos. The ritual? What ritual? What did they mean? You've heard the stories, haven't you? The figure continued, its voice becoming more insistent, more demanding. The ones that spoke of Sarah O'Bannon, the girl who was lost, the one who never truly died. She lives, Eleanor. She lives. But only through the ritual. The shadows around her seemed to deepen, drawing closer, encircling her, and she felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as though something was trying to break free from within her. It was then that she saw it, a faint flickering light in the distance, something beyond the shadows, beyond the dark presence that surrounded her. It was a memory, or perhaps a vision, but it was undeniably real. It was Sarah. Eleanor's vision blurred as she saw a girl standing alone in a dimly lit room, her face pale and her eyes hollow. Sarah's hands were bound, her wrists shackled to an ancient stone altar. Blood stained the floor around her, dark and sticky, and her mouth was open, but no sound came out. She was trapped. The vision shifted, and now Eleanor saw the girl standing before her, not in chains, but free.